What's up everybody, Josh Smith here. Just want to take a quick second and share a demo with you on how to illustrate in Illustrator. I know we only met once this week. Thought it would help with your projects that we're working on for next week. Of course, over the weekend, if there's anything that I can help you with, don't be afraid to reach out and let me know. But other than that, let's jump into the demo. Right, so let's take a look at how to illustrate in Adobe Illustrator. Just a quick tip on the concept of how to illustrate in Adobe Illustrator and then how to sort of step-by-step processes of thinking about doing that. When we work in Illustrator, really the thing is that you are trying to build illustrations in Adobe Illustrator. So it's a little bit different than the traditional way of illustrating sort of by hand, painting, drawing, some of your other programs like Photoshop or Procreate that allow you to paint and draw similar to what you can do on paper or on a canvas. Illustrator is a little bit different in that you're focused on trying to build your illustrations. And we do that by primarily overlapping objects. And I have a couple examples that I hope will help with this. So there's a few ways that we can overlap our objects. Here is one piece of object that I've created. It is just sort of a rounded rectangle shape. But I can make copies of this and then paste it on top. So that is either Command C to copy and Command F to paste in front, or Command Shift V to paste in place. So I literally have just a copy. Now of course if I wanted to, I could just make this sort of an outline and give it a kind of a thicker outline so that it looks like there's a shape there, right? There's two shapes, it's sort of an outline. But this doesn't give you a lot of control for what you can do with this outline. So if I were to make a copy, and then make a little bit smaller shape on the inside of that and choose the color with the eyedropper, which is just clicking on another color that has in there. This gives me so much more control over the shape of the line quality that's on the outside of this object. And then of course I can layer more objects on top, whatever those other things are that I want to create in this space. So if I start creating more shapes, I will just layer those objects up on top of whatever this object is. So I don't know exactly what this is supposed to be. It's just a nice kind of decorative element, but I can change the color of these objects, playing around with layering these shapes up. So we'll do a little darker color on top. So whatever this thing is supposed to be, like a little button or a pennant or something, I can just go ahead and start creating that. And again, this gives so much more line character by layering my shapes in this way than if I were to just switch to an outline. No matter what the size of the outline is, and even if you give it a profile, which is sort of similar effect of being able to change this sort of like line outline, it still doesn't give you as much character or much control over the character as it does when you layer your objects in this way. So like I can offset this, and that is sort of the next step, is to be able to select multiple shapes and click on one, hold shift and click on another one to be able to offset these, and this gives me so much more control over the line quality. You know, air quotes line. Like this doesn't, it looks like a line because it's just an outline or sort of a black line, but it's actually a full shape that is just layered on top. So when we're layering our objects, just splitting this up, this is on the bottom, this is in the middle, and this is on top. So that helps me create layering, and that's what we're doing when we overlap our objects. So that's sort of the first step. This is sort of like 3 steps going up this staircase, is layering your objects up. Now this is also including sort of an example of step 2, which is offsetting your objects. So rather than just having them line up perfectly in the center, I can also choose how they align. So that if I want to do something like this, and then again, if this is like a pennant, let's just make it go vertical because that'll look like a nice little pennant like on a necklace or something. This will give me so much more character to be able to layer my objects in this way. I can kind of then create, other shapes to make it look like it is, curved, have a little bit of dimension, some light and shadow. We'll just make this shape a little bit darker color like the one I had before, and now we're starting to make like a jewel or something in that vein. I can then also create other shapes that are layered on top to sort of give it this kind of cutting, cut jewel effect. And this is a good example of the next step in those 3, which is playing with figure and ground. And that's down here, this figure and ground option. That's sort of step 3. So first, again, we layered our objects, put something on the bottom, put something on top, put something above that, continuing to layer up above those things. There are different ways that you could layer these objects. Again, talking about layering objects if you want to reset them in different layers. If I want this blue one to be in the back rather than the black one, I can just move it to the back, and that's going to the object menu, choosing Arrange and Send to Back. And I memorized the hotkeys for these two, so Send to Back or Send to Front, and I can just sort of do those. So Command and Shift and the apostrophes, I'm sorry, not the apostrophes, the bracket keys will allow you to bounce these back and forth in the layer order, and you just layer those objects that way. So if I want this one behind it, making it look like it's got like a shiny edge on one side that is behind this object. Again, another way of using layering objects to illustrate in Illustrator. So this makes it look like this black object. The sort of pennant design that I'm coming up with also has a little bit of light on the edge, but it's actually just two objects that are underneath and on top of each other. So different ways that you can illustrate in Illustrator within layering objects, which is pretty fun. Offsetting objects, again, is the second one, and that's just sort of figuring out where they can line up. And then figure and ground. And let me talk about figure and ground, or number 3. And that is just making it look like this object that's underneath is cut because of the way that these two black objects overlap. There's just two objects. One's kind of the outside edge that I've changed with the fill, and I'm hitting Shift X again to sort of change whether that is a fill or an outline. And then the same thing with this one. So if I put those into the space, the way that they overlap and include each other in some of their space makes it look like this object is cut, but it's really not. It's just more overlapping objects to be able to create the illusion that there's depth there. And this is a really great way to build your objects because nothing is like damaged or permanently cut. Of course you can cut your objects if you want to. So right, I could take these two objects over here, I'll make a copy by holding down the Option key and clicking and dragging on them. If I really wanted to cut these out, I would select them both, go to the Pathfinder panel. You can go to Window and Pathfinder to be able to find this. If I want to cut it out, I can just use this shape mode, which will take away or minus the front object from the one behind it. Now it is actually cut. And of course, that's always something you can do. But rather than make permanent cuts, this is sort of a destructive way to edit this object, I can just do it through the illusion of making sure that the colors of the objects that overlap within the background of this sort of teal blue piece makes it look like it's cut. And that's what we're talking about figure and ground. Figure in this case is the blue object that's on top, and the ground then becomes these two pieces that are one above and one below that blue object to make it look like it is cut. So this is the process, sort of the idea of using Adobe Illustrator to overlap objects. This is the basis of pretty much every illustration that you see out there, no matter what you're looking at. A couple examples of what you can do with these things is once, of course, you come up with very good formal objects, the first step is to come up with fun objects, but all of them are built out of just similarly created pieces. So it doesn't have to be something that's insanely complex to draw. Like if I was to draw this on paper, it would take me forever to try and get this to like line up and be perfect. But Illustrator helps you do that. So these are just circle shapes that I have edited to be able to change their form and their shape. And these are all just pieces that were either combined using Pathfinder or things that were used and cut and then flipped and mirrored so that they look like they mirror each other. And so it's very sort of simple when you think about it in broken down terms. This is just a sphere. So using my sphere ellipse tool, which is L, I can click and drag, holding down Option to be able to create it from the center, holding down Shift to make it a perfectly round circle. Now I just need to cut the bottom edge off of this circle. There's a point already here in the center. I'll just put 2 points off to the side with my pen tool by clicking on the sphere itself, and then with my A direct selection tool, the white arrow tool, I can click on the third point that's in the center and delete. And that just creates a nice cut into that circle. Now most of these objects are similarly created. They're just multiple circles. Like this one, it looks complex, it's really not. I can just mimic that shape. I'll make a copy of the circle by hitting Command C, Command F to paste in front, and then I will just click and drag while holding Shift and then also holding Option to drag it from the center, and then just move it down into place. That's more or less the same object. Clicking and dragging in the center piece to drag it up a little bit, make it a little bit longer, and holding Shift to keep its proportions the same. Now I can just use my pen tool to continue finishing drawing this object by connecting these points that were not connected. So it's not a complicated form necessarily. It's sort of formally well made because it is perfect circles, and I know I can rely on those tools to be able to build these pieces. And then all of these things can sort of be deconstructed. Another way to make these little pointed pieces essentially is to then drag up these circles. So let's start with a regular circle again. Cut off the bottom half, using my white arrow tool to select that bottom point, hitting delete, and then I just pull on this to come up. If I want it to be more pointed, I can reduce the angle of these handlebars on either side. So it's fairly easy to be able to get to a space where you can create custom shapes by starting with basic shapes first. This is similar to the process that I went through to be able to create this thing. It's just using another piece of itself. So if I make two copies, turn it, let's do it vertical, I'll click and drag it down, we'll just flip it around. I could flip it this way to rotate it, but if I want it to be a perfect mirror, I can use this tool, which is the reflect tool, the hotkey is O, just double clicking on that to flip it around, and then a little dialog box will tell me which way did you want to flip it. You want to flip it horizontal? Yes, because that's what it's showing me that I want to do. And then I can connect this piece with my pen tool to be able to reconnect those. So it's a similar process to be able to create these forms. I maybe reduced the amount of curvature that was on these by clicking on this while holding the Option key with my pen tool to give it a little bit more of a point. I can also align these points so that they are perfectly straight, and let's even those out a little bit. So similar process to be able to create formal shapes this way and then just find ways to layer them within your illustration. It's a pretty fun way to build things in Illustrator. You can build illustrations. I know we're working with letter forms for this particular project, but you can go through a similar process. I do have some formal objects that I have created that you can sort of see the process of deconstructing them. This seems like a very complicated illustration. It is basically the same content. So it's all grouped together at this time. I can double click on it to go into isolation mode. Of course, if you want to group an object that's not grouped, this object is now ungrouped. It's individual pieces. If I hit Shift, Command, and G, they're all individual pieces. I can select the whole thing, go to the Object menu, and choose Group to group them together so that whenever I click on just one piece, it'll select the whole thing. But I can double click into isolation mode. I'm in isolation mode. You can see it here within this kind of window space. I can actually click on these individual pieces and just move them around. Again, these are grouped objects, not very complicated necessarily. The type by itself, the crown is a different piece. This banner is also a different piece. Whoops, I guess I have another banner underneath it that I forgot was there. I'll just delete that one, I don't need it. There are some little additional pieces that I put in here to sort of cover up some different changes in color that were showing up underneath the letter and between the sort of the lettering and the banners themselves. And then these are a blending mode option to be able to transitionally blend two objects. I will show that to you another time, but not a very complicated process of creating those using the computer's sort of mathematical precision to be able to create these round shapes. Again, just based on circles. And then I have two pieces here. So I sort of have an outline and then the color behind it to separate those two pieces. So not a terribly complicated design process of being able to layer these objects on top of each other to create a nice kind of layered space, which is fun. Now again, I know we're using mostly letter forms. Different ways that you might be able to start with these things is making sure that you make lots of copies. So if I know that this is sort of the form that I wanted, we did just work on the letter forms last week, being able to add some dimension to them, you know, sort of being able to draw shapes on top of them in this way. I'm going to just start with my pen tool. I'll sort of start over here, click and drag to create a similar shape that I have underneath, and just going through trying to find space to be able to align and sort of change the color to these objects. And maybe we'll have a little bit of an outline in between to sort of separate these two colors that I want on this sort of banner or ribbon looking lettering. Now it's not perfect, I can edit it, right? I can use my white arrow tool to pull on these handlebars, adjust it just slightly, and then let's give it a color. I have a little color palette off to the side here. I can click on that object, then use my eyedropper to select a color, something that complements that very bright blue, super bright blue. So something to that effect. And again, it looks like there's an outline or a line in the center. It's really just the space created between these two shapes that are on top. And of course, you know, it takes a little bit of time. It's okay to take a little bit of time and sort of edit these objects, make them look nice, align them well, kind of position them in a space that makes sense for what you're trying to illustrate or draw. And then I'll continue that way. You know, maybe it'll flip underneath and twist under here as I'm imagining it would, and then continue with these, you know, color palette as I create those, the word vote. So something to do. The last thing that we talked about last time was to create some shapes from your forms that you already have. And just so you can see this process, I'll take this piece over here and we'll do something similar. So this is just the V that I had from before. Let me make it a little bit darker blue. But this V is really not a complicated shape necessarily. It's just precise kind of curves within the pen tool Bezier system. I can, using a lighter color, start from there. I could create some really beautiful forms by clicking and dragging, holding Shift and Option to drag and make a copy, and then just repeat this process, just duplicate that to create this sort of like formally three-dimensional object. I do want to make the first one on top, so I move that to the front. Again, Object Arrange, Bring to Front, and then select the others by holding Shift. That'll select all of the others except for that one that I just had selected, and then eyedrop a solid color. And this creates, you know, something that looks three-dimensional. And I can just sort of create these multitude of copies. Let me do that one more time so that you can see how to make your copies. Hold down the Option key, click and drag on this object, hold Shift, and then hit Command D. Every time you hit the D, it will duplicate that action, that previous action of moving that object and making a copy. I can then, again, Object Arrange, Bring to Front, or if you know the hotkey, Command Shift and close bracket. That'll bring it to the front. I just then need to hold Shift, clicking and dragging over top of all these objects, select all the other ones except for the first one, and then I can just duplicate or eyedrop this color palette. It creates this sort of three-dimensional effect. And of course I don't want all these lines in here. I just need this to be one flat object to make it look like it has three-dimensional space. So I'm going to go to the Pathfinder tool and use this Unite feature. This will just flatten this whole object as if it is one piece, which is exactly what I want. I kind of need to get rid of some of these points here because they are sort of in the way of this bubble effect. I don't really need a bubbling kind of effect between these long lines, so I can go with my pen tool and click on these points to subtract them. I'm not holding anything on the keyboard, just if you hover over a point that already exists in space with your pen tool, it will subtract those points. So I'll go down and get rid of all of them except for the top and bottom one. Again, just formally creating nice, good forms as I go through. So it gives it this sort of three-dimensional look. Now that's just one thing stylistically to do. There's lots of fun stuff that you can do with this. I might put an interior line, right? So I could make my pen tool, click and drag, come down here, click and drag, and then again it's filled. I'll make that an outline, just layering those shapes up again. So just another way to sort of interact with your forms. Now everyone has a different idea of what their illustration is going to be, what they would formally like to kind of illustrate in that space. And so your journey or your exploration of being able to layer those shapes may be different than mine. These are just some tips that I have for you, but we can individually talk about different ideas that you might have for how to illustrate, and I can maybe help you break down a style. So that's always something that we can do. And you know, it takes some time to get these things to sort of formally fit together. So don't worry about it if it takes some time. Have fun with it. This is really the fun part of being able to create your artwork. And you've already spent so much time on your ideas, coming up with what you want to say and the formal aspects of that concept. So just have fun with the art process. All right, thanks guys. Have a good weekend.